Fresh allegations that Russian forces murdered Ukrainian civilians outside Kyiv have rapidly found their way to the UN General Assembly. 93 countries voted to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, a humiliating move that Moscow immediately condemned as illegitimate and politically motivated. But does Russia really care what the world thinks about its invasion? My guest this week from Moscow is the former Deputy Foreign Minister Andre Fedorov. As Russia finally acknowledges significant military losses, does Mr. Putin realize he's beginning to lose his war?
This is the position of Putin, and you should understand that this person, I know him for many years, will not step back. He will continue till he will reach the goal. We don't have a real picture of what is going on. And this is maybe a mistake in our information campaign.
As Russia focuses its attacks on the south and east of Ukraine, Western governments are tightening sanctions on Moscow, but will they change the Kremlin's mind? And has Vladimir Putin just ripped up the nuclear doctrine that's kept the peace between the superpowers for 60 years? All that and more on Conflict Zone. Andre Fedorov, welcome to Conflict Zone.
Thank you.
You're a former Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, and you now advise Putin's administration on foreign policy issues. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
You were last in Ukraine in January. Russia has said its so-called special military operation was to liberate Ukraine from Nazis. But we now have, despite Moscow's denials, credible allegations of war crimes carried out by Russian forces, including summary executions of civilians, torture, rape. When is the Kremlin going to drop the pretense that it's there to protect people and start admitting that its aim is just to control the country any way it can?
It's a very serious question because originally this special military operation was planned to be concentrated on Donbas territory, Donetsk and Lugansk republics. But later on, it became with more broad goal, which Putin described as denazification and demilitarization of Ukraine. And in fact, of course, total elimination of the possible threat from Ukraine to Russia. And that's why this military operation today is turning more and more into real war, though the war is not declared.
But it's hard for Moscow, isn't it, to stick to this rationale or the declared rationale? Since when does liberation involve destroying residential areas wholesale, shelling civilian infrastructure, shooting civilians, raping women, and stealing civilian property? Doesn't have much to do with liberation, does it?
In certain way, yes, of course, but war is war, and such kind of things happen. The question is...
Really? I mean, is that a justification for the tremendous brutality that we've seen?
No, it's a reality of war. I've seen many wars in my life. In different parts of the world. And more or less the picture sometimes is the same.
This is a war of choice, isn't it, though? This was Moscow's war of choice.
It was Moscow's decision. Yes, it was Moscow's decision, and Moscow is trying to implement it in a full strength. This is the position of Putin, and you should understand that this person, I know him for many years, will not step back. He will continue till he will reach the goal. And the goal is to change, frankly speaking, to change the regime in Ukraine and to make Ukraine, if not friendly, but a kind of neutral country, which he will not consider as a danger for Russia.
It's a country that's going to hate Russia for the foreseeable future for what it's done, killing its people and destroying cities and towns.
This is one of the biggest problems. When I was visiting Ukraine many times during last years, And of course, the mood is changing. If, for example, 10 years ago, there were much more pro-Russian feelings, especially in the eastern Ukraine. But now the situation is changing. And during my last visits to Ukraine, I've seen this with my own eyes, that even the Russian-speaking population is now changing its opinion. And this now is maybe a turning point. The problem is that in the current situation, we are really see Ukraine now as anti-Russia. And this is probably the worst case scenario for us, because with such kind of mood of the nation, it will be very hard to achieve the goals which were put in front of this operation. And I see that this kind of psychological tension in Ukrainian society will have a very long-term influence.
And very long-term negative effects for Russia.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And not only for Russian leadership, because unfortunately, a lot of my friends in Ukraine are now considering Russia and Russian citizens as enemies, as invaders, etc., etc. So this is ruining a lot of personal contacts, ruining a lot of historical traditions, historical ties, and to overcome this current crisis will be terribly difficult.
Mr. Putin has repeatedly complained that the West never listened to Russia's what he called legitimate security concerns. But when it did listen and all the Western leaders trooped off to Moscow to talk to him, he simply lied direct to their faces and presented them with an ultimatum he knew they couldn't accept. That wasn't serious diplomacy, was it?
I should start from somewhere from 2007 or something like this, from his Munich speech. When Putin became president at the beginning of 2000, he was really thinking about having good dialogue with Europe, with the United States, with NATO. He was trying to make some steps towards. But the problem that within this dialogue, he became more and more disappointed, and he feels himself that the attitude from the West to Russia is more or less becoming the same like it was towards the Soviet Union. And for Putin, the current policy is the current, from his point of view, the policy of protection Russia from the same problems which Soviet Union faced. And he is considering military danger from the West, from NATO, as one of the key challenges for him personally as well.
But isn't it true that he just wanted to get his hands on Ukraine and control it from top to bottom by any means available to him? And he wasn't going to ever negotiate that seriously. You don't. I mean, you've been a deputy foreign minister. You don't negotiate by just putting down all your demands into a draft treaty, telling everyone to sign it, and threatening them with force if they don't. That's not genuine diplomacy, is it?
Genuine diplomacy in the current situation is not working at all. Because, as I said, this situation is very strange from many points of view. It's not the war, it's a special military operation. It's a situation when Geneva Convention on War, Prisoners of War is not working, and many other things. The problem is the following, that we lost a lot of time before all these things started. There were chances in the past to solve a number of issues with Ukraine, but it was not met from Ukrainian side sometimes with a reasonable response. Sometimes it was mistakes from our side. And now traditional diplomacy, by the way, which takes a lot of time, is not working.
Mr. Fedorov, all that talk that we heard over the years about Ukrainians and Russians being one people, and then to prove those strong ties, you climb into your tanks and you go and kill them. Already more than 1,400 civilians have died. Does nobody in the Russian government, and you deal with the presidential administration, does nobody there have any concept of the senseless misery that they're causing to Ukraine?
I would like to say that psychologically, we are still the same nation, the same Slavic nation. Russian and Ukrainians are very close still, even in this
But you're
period
brutalizing them day by day.
Yes, it's a problem of military operation, and it's a problem of vision, because for a big part of our leadership, if not for all, it's considered not as war against Ukraine and Ukrainians. They consider that it's a war against Nazis.
Well, they're living in fantasy land then, aren't they?
Maybe some people, yes, because I think that sometimes there is not enough understanding what is going inside Ukraine. And I see that there were some miscalculations during last years concerning Ukraine.
Mr. Fedorov, in the UN General Assembly, 93 countries voted to suspend Russia from the Human Rights Council, citing reports of gross and systematic violations and abuses of human rights. Not a surprise, was it, after all the latest allegations of civilian executions in Bucha and other places previously occupied by Russian units? The world isn't buying the Kremlin's denials. Does Putin care one way or the other?
First of all, Russia was ready for such kind of voting, and it was not a shock, not a surprise for Moscow. But about this body, we don't care too much. For us, of course, the most important thing is Security Council and our ability to continue to be present there, to work there, to bring our views there. But the risk of growing isolation of Russia is existing. I should confirm it.
It's never been a problem for the Russian security forces to kill in large numbers, has it? We saw this in the two wars in Chechnya, tens of thousands killed, the capital Grozny devastated by massive Russian bombing and shelling with very little regard for civilians. Russia's army doesn't do small surgical strikes, does it?
I think that Chechnya experience is influencing today on the special military operation in Ukraine, because till today, Russian army is trying to avoid direct heavy attacks, missile attacks on big cities like Kharkov, Kyiv, etc., etc.
But we've seen Mariupol devastated, completely devastated.
Mariupol, yes, I know. I am in contact with my friends in Mariupol. The city is destroyed nearly 90% today. This is clear. This is the reality.
And we've just had a bomb over the railway station in Kramatorsk in the east that's killed at least 50 people.
Yeah, but this
so
case...
there's no regard for civilian life at all, is there? No, none.
Concerning this last case, it's a missile, not a bomb. And it needs a special investigation still on this case, because this Kramatorsk, by the way, is was one of the most pro-Russian cities in Ukraine previously.
Mr. Fedorov, political killings have been on the rise as well under this government, haven't they? In Russia itself, in other countries, we've seen one after another of President Putin's political opponents. They've been attacked, murdered, mysteriously fallen off their balconies or had their clothes smeared with chemical agents. This government has no qualms about killing for purely political reasons, does it?
It's hard to say if it's a political killing in some cases. Of course, the opposition against Putin is not welcomed in Russia, and it's obvious. Why?
That's an understatement, isn't it? It's crushed. It's crushed.
Today, opposition to Putin is smashed and crashed, and it's not existing anymore.
Isn't it a long-established Kremlin tradition and conviction that ruling by fear and violence is much more effective than trying to be liked, isn't it?
in certain way, it's tradition for Russia. If we will take even the Tsar's period or Imperial Russia period, it was more or less the same methods of in political life, especially before the Russian Revolution. You should also understand that Russian political culture is totally different in many cases from European political culture. And sometimes there is a feeling that fist is stronger than word.
You talk almost academically about what's going on, but aren't you ashamed personally of what your forces are doing in Ukraine?
First of all, even me and many others, we don't have a real picture of what is going on. And this is maybe a mistake in our information campaign, because from my point of view, and I expressed it publicly, we need to seriously enlarge the volume of the information of activity of our forces there, because
you can see the pictures, you can see the devastation.
Yes, I can see
the bodies. Aren't you ashamed of that?
It's a tragedy. It's a real tragedy. What has happened today in Kramatorsk with the 50 people killed in one more big tragedy for Ukraine as well for Russia. I think that Russia needs to be much more open in information space, show what was real and what was fake.
It's not going to happen, is it? It's not going to happen. There's a huge clampdown on media. Virtually all independent media has been shut down, hasn't it?
Not all, but close to.
Virtually.
Yes. Many of them are now labeled as foreign agents and are not capable to present their opinion to the public. Though, of course, still there are possibilities for some individuals to raise their voice against the military operation. But generally, at this stage, the mood in the nation is in favor of Putin's action. It should be understood.
It's already clear that in a number of key aspects, Russia's military operation has failed, at least in terms of its initial aims. You said yourself in February, Putin's initial instruction, was to have a full victory over Ukraine by March the 2nd. Here we are, more than a month on. Russian forces seem to have given up on Kyiv, and they've been routed from a number of towns and locations. And finally, we had an admission that they have suffered significant losses. Who is going to be paying for those failures of the Russian army?
It's still very hard to say it's a failure or not, because the battle is still going on. And Kremlin
but the army has performed poorly, hasn't it?
The army is not performing. The army is performing more or less in a normal way, like they are ordered. They are ordered to act.
But poor planning, supply lines that didn't supply, tanks that ran out of fuel, that kind of thing.
The problem is the other, that the territory on which Russian army now is operating is much larger than it was probably originally planned.
What, they didn't have a map? They didn't know how large it was?
No, it's not a map. It's not a map, because even if you take the decree of Putin, it was a decree, special military operation for secure Donbas and Lugansk republics. There was no word in this decree about Kyiv, about Kharkov, about Odessa or something like this. But the problem is that internal contradiction is in the fact that the main goal, as it was called, demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine, is not possible only on the limited territory of Donbas and Lugansk, even Mariupol, etc. If Russia wants to realize all these goals, it needs to control the whole territory of Ukraine. And
Mr. Fedorov, it's not going to...
And of course, this task needs much more forces than are now in Ukraine.
But it's already clear that this war is a disaster for your country because it's brought Russia all the things it doesn't want. Russia wanted recognition and respect, seats at all the global top tables. Now it's being shunned. It wanted less NATO on its borders. It's going to get much, much more. It's got a huge economic hit, and its clampdown is forcing the brightest young people in the country to leave in their tens of thousands. Can you think of one single benefit this war has brought to Russia?
At this stage, I don't see any benefits myself. Even more, on one of the TV shows in Moscow, I named two figures. In 1980, the first real war year in Afghanistan, we lost in 1 year 1,584 soldiers and officers. More or less the same figure we lost in 1 month in Ukraine. So compare this, and you will understand that this is a problem for Russia. And even Peskov, a press secretary for Putin, is recognizing these losses. These losses will have, of course, a very serious influence later on domestic situation in Russia, because what is the most dangerous scenario for Russia is that such kind of military operation will last long.
But does Putin realize that with all these apparently unforeseen reactions and results from this war, that he's actually losing it? He's not going to win this. The West has said, they're determined that he shall not win in Ukraine.
There is another feeling in Kremlin, and it was, by the way, just yesterday, once again reflected by Peskov, Putin's press secretary, that the victory is near. This feeling is dominating still.
Explain, can you?
There is a feeling that more or less in the coming days or maybe coming weeks, the military victory will be reached, and this will turn Ukraine leadership on their knees, and they will agree on any document to be signed with Russia.
They really believe that, still?
Yes, there is a belief.
And the Western sanctions and the Western support that's being given to Ukraine hasn't changed their mind about any of this?
Frankly speaking, Western sanctions are, in fact, long-term sanctions, and they're not influencing today very seriously, though yesterday it was published the figure that 60% of Russian citizens feel themselves the influence of the sanctions. But for everyday lives, the sanctions are not actual, they're not so serious. But the question is how long it will, the whole story will go. And the other thing is that Moscow and Russia still don't feel themselves in international isolation. And this gives a certain logical strength to Putin, position of China, for example.
You think they're just kidding themselves? You think they just don't want to see reality? They're living in some sort of parallel universe here, aren't they?
Yeah, sometimes we can say that we are living in the ivory tower. And I think that there is, of course, now more wish to see the victory than realization of the fact that the victory is still far.
Do you accept that thanks to Russia, the world is going to be a much, much more dangerous place in years to come? By waving his nuclear weapons at the West, Putin has challenged the doctrine that has held for 60 years that no nuclear-armed states would fight a war with each other because neither side could win. But Putin now seems to be saying, well, I know you, to the West, I know you've got nuclear weapons, but I might use mine anyway. That's a huge upset for this doctrine of mutually assured destruction, isn't it?
Yeah, I am sure that after this Ukrainian war crisis will be over, the world will be totally different, and all the previous approaches, all the previous conceptions of mutual deterrence, of the balance, will not work anymore. And I can agree with you that it's a very dangerous development of the situation, because the existence of nuclear arsenal will be not anymore both psychological and military barrier.
Andre Fedorov, thanks very much for being on Conflict Zone. Thank you. Thank you for your time.
Thanks.